Does the party of no have an answer to the cry for reparations for slavery? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Men, you certainly heard it. Once again, periodically, this cry for payment of reparations to descendants of African-American people who were brought to the United States and held in bondage, reparations for slavery, has once again risen to the top of the Democrat playlist. Republicans tend to have a quick answer to that, which is no. And the reason for that is because it wasn't our fault that what happened to the slaves. How could we identify the people to actually pay? It wouldn't necessarily solve the problem. I don't want to talk about any of that in this episode, frankly. I'm not making the argument for or against reparations. What I'm asking is, given the situation as it is in much of the African-American community, or at least some of the African-American community across the country, should Republicans have something else to talk about other than reparations when they see things that are identified by people in the African-American community as things like inherent bias, institutional racism, unequal justice under law, generational poverty, broken city schools, and broken communities? Stephen Green, doesn't it seem like should be a Republican answer to addressing that problem that doesn't just involve ridiculing the Democrats or destroying their argument for reparations?
There are so many things. First of all, when we talked about this on the backstage, you framed it in a way that how do we make this same emotional appeal that the progressives do? And I say we can't. That's a race to the bottom, and it's a race that we lose every time. But there are still other things we can do. It's a lot of Republicans like to portray themselves as being the party of law and order. And, what that's resulted in, and this is something that may involve some kind of reparation or at least an apology. But thanks to this drug war, we have taken 3 generations now of would-be entrepreneurs and taught them that the best way out of this grinding life is to become a criminal, to take your risk-taking ability, which not all people possess, unfortunately, and channel it into criminal activity. And it's been a horrible waste of human potential and human talent. Drugs are a scourge, but maybe there is something better we can do to reduce the effects of this scourge. And I don't think that taking 3 generations of entrepreneurs and encouraging them to become criminals has done anything to help the scourge of drugs, and it certainly hasn't done anything to help Black America, and that's just sad. And the other thing is, I think charter schools are great. I think getting government more and more out of education is a necessity, but so often Republicans are selling this stuff in the suburbs, where the public schools tend to be pretty good. The big push for charter schools, for privatized education, shouldn't be where we are, where the schools are well maintained and the teachers have small classes of mostly well-behaved kids. Let's bring this into the cities. Let's say, hey, we're going to help take care of this problem where it's really bad before we go and expand our already decent schools out here in the burbs. There are so many approaches we could be taking, but this attitude of let us assuage our white guilt by cutting you a check and then forgetting about you again is not the way to do it.
Bill Whittle, Republicans tend to be the people who don't think that government is the solution to anything. But when you look at the problems that beset the African-American community, and I don't even like that term because there's no monolithic African-American community, but for want of a better term, that afflict African-Americans across the country as individuals and within communities that are primarily African-American. Many of these effects, modern day effects that are hurting them, have to do with government. Whether that's the justice system, whether that's the way that benefits programs are administered, whether that's the way schools are run and administered. A lot of these things are government caused or government facilitated problems. So what would you suggest Republicans come forward with in terms of a government solution to some of these problems?
Well, there is no government solution to these problems, and that's we need, as Republicans, we need to understand that in advance. It's not how we lead the argument, but that's just the truth. This can be accomplished, and it can be accomplished by Republicans, but in order to do so, it'll take a bit of eloquence and absolute moral fearlessness. So it's never going to happen. But the way out of this, I think, is to just have an honest-to-God discussion, man-to-man, so to speak, about where this is. You can't talk about things like police treatment of black suspects differently than white suspects, because there's no question that that's the case in many areas. But you cannot address that issue if you don't address the issue that 5% of the population, 10% of the population is causing 60% of the crime. These things are welded together. And for us to say we can talk about one but not the other is just plain cowardice, and it simply doesn't get to the heart of the problem. But the ultimate issue here is not the issue of reparations. The ultimate issue is the question of mental slavery. It's the question of being emotionally and mentally enslaved to the past. You could make a pretty compelling argument that a definition of a slave is somebody who has their housing, their food, their medical care, their clothing, and transportation provided for them in exchange for them doing the bidding of their masters. And they can't leave. And that's as good a description of inner city black America as you could possibly come up with. So the slavery that they're talking about is not the slavery of 1864. It's the slavery of 2019 that's being imposed upon them by these progressive Democrats who have constantly told them that everything that ever goes wrong in your life is because of this thing that happened 150 years ago. Now, in terms of getting over the slavery thing mentally, all I can do is point to personal experience. When I say personal experience, I know people are going to laugh, and it should probably be mentioned just in passing that there is not a human being alive on the earth today who did not have slaves as ancestors at some point in the past. There's absolutely no question about it, none, zero. Every single person here on this planet had slaves for ancestors, and that's all there is to it. But let me just give you an example about how you can use this kind of mental reappraisal to maybe help. On my mom's side of the family, my grandfather, my mother's father, was British, and he was knighted. He wasn't knighted. He was made an Order of the British Empire. This is a high-level thing. He was in the Royal Navy, and so I always thought, wow, maybe we have some kind of, he's friends with Ian Fleming and all the rest of this stuff. And then my cousin took a look at my father's family, and we ran it back to about 1740. And it turns out that on my father's side of the family, we are nothing but mill workers and coal miners. Mill workers means 3 generations of my ancestors had wooden paddles about this big with a leather strap. They would give them a raw piece of cotton, and they would do this for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, just getting all the strands aligned and all the seeds out of it. And when you go to coal mining, especially when you go to backyard coal mining, now you're really talking about something. George Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier. My family's from Wigan. And the conditions that he described in 1920s and 1930s Britain, that late, easily match the worst situation you can find in an American ghetto in terms of squalor, sickness, disease, hopelessness, and all the rest. So here's the point. When I first heard about this and realized that this is actually who I am, I'm descended from coal miners and the lowest of the low. At first I thought, well, it sucks. Kind of would have rather been descended from kings and princes. But my attitude on this changed very, 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 very quickly. Very, very quickly. I couldn't be prouder of the people that came before me. I couldn't be prouder of the fact that their skin looked like it was tattooed, because anytime they'd get scratches from the flaking coal, the coal dust would get into the scratches and heal over and stay there. They looked like their faces were completely tattooed. They had scabs on the back of their vertebrae from brushing up against the ceilings. Most people don't know this. I'm just trying to make the case here. But you think you go down into a coal mine and then you go to work. But you would go down into a coal mine and sometimes you'd have to walk 1.5 miles bent over in a 3-foot-high tunnel before you can start working. And you're not paid for that either. So the reason I bring this up is this. When I think about where my ancestors came from, when I think about the work they did and the sacrifices they made and the effort and the fact that they had families and that they had love for each other and that they made this thing work in a world where they would wake up and have to smash the ice on the bowl in the morning before you could shave, or where an entire member of the family, all of them, all 10 of them, would take a bath once a week. Father first, because he was the dirtiest, and by the time the littlest kid got in there, the water was the color of India ink. It was absolutely black, and you want to be careful, because if you're going to put the baby in there and wash the baby, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bath water, and that's where the term comes from, because the water is absolutely opaque. So this is who I'm from. This is who I am. This is me. This is my background. But if you look at my history, you see coal miner, coal miner, coal miner. You see mill worker, mill worker, mill worker, mill worker. Then you see a couple generations of plumbers. Then you get to my grandfather, telephone line man. My father, hotel manager. Me, internet pundit.
Progress, baby.
But in all seriousness, my grandfather, who hung telephone lines in Pennsylvania in February for 30 years, wanted to be a writer very much. And I've read some of his stuff, and he was very good. He wanted to be a writer, but he couldn't be a writer. He just couldn't. He had 7 kids that he had to feed. And so he sacrificed what he wanted to do for what he had to do. And because my grandfather, who wanted to be a writer, ended up hanging telephone lines, I get to be a writer. And that, to me, is a source of infinitely greater pride than to find out that, I'm descended from the 4th Earl of Norwich or something, who squandered the fortune on gambling and whores. Where we came from is a measure of where we're going, only to the degree that the lower you start from, the more magnificent your progress becomes. And I would simply say that to everybody who feels some shame in their family history, or feel like that their family was always the lowest of the low. My family wasn't just the lowest of the low. My family was working underground beneath the lowest of the low. And I am not only not ashamed of that, I'm just astonishingly filled with pride every time I think about how miserable their lives were and the sacrifices they made so that mine wouldn't have to be. And this is not unique to me or anyone else. This is the story we need to be telling everybody, that it's not where you came from, it's where you're going.
There are cultural and institutional and governmental and personal problems related to race in this country today. But there are 2 things that I can say with some confidence about them. Number 1, they're not caused by slavery. And number 2, they won't be solved by reparations. That doesn't mean I diminish the problems. In fact, I think by putting the slavery thing aside and dealing with life as it is today, I take the problem with more seriousness. Because I'm not going to trivialize your life by saying to you, oh, if we can only get you a little money from the government, preferably taken away from those fat cats who earn too much money beyond what they deserve, then somehow the anguish of your soul will be addressed and everything will turn around for you. That's just not the case. I think that Republicans, in particular, do an exceedingly poor job of reaching out to concentrations of communities where there are people of color. And I think that if anything, if the Republicans would just make a concerted effort on a regular basis to spend a little time among people who don't look like their suburban base, then the whole party would be better off. Not only because they'd make more personal connections and relationships that might result in votes someday, but also because they'd learn a little bit about how this country is. They'd learn a little bit about what kind of lives voters have. If you just take a few minutes and sit on a stoop with somebody and talk to them about their life, you get a better sense of who they are instead of sitting in your, mahogany paneled office and waiting for the lobbyists to come to you. And so on a positive note, I think that Republicans can do some tangible things that would make life better for African Americans in this country, and they could distinguish themselves from Democrats in the sense that they're saying, look, I'm not trying to assuage the grievance industry and throw you a few bones that we pulled off the bodies of rich people so that you'll feel better about yourself. I want to deal with the concrete issues that you face today. And that starts with listening to you. That starts with finding out what you think those concrete issues are. That starts with living in your skin and walking in your shoes and finding out what it's like to be you and to be part of this American experiment as you see it. So Republicans need to step up in that area. In addition, I think that there are some government-caused problems that do have a government solution. I think that the problems that are caused by government-funded, taxpayer-funded, government-run schools can be addressed by government. I don't necessarily think that means more government. I think it may mean less government in control of those schools. But clearly, government caused the problem. Government can do something about it. I think that there are problems with the way we administer public charitable programs that can be addressed by government and need to be addressed by government. And I think Republicans should be at the forefront of those things. There should be proposals for how to make life better for the people who are captive, in a sense, to government, without making Republicans into the party that's handing out the candy the way the Democrats have found, so that they can keep those people as Bill has referred to it, as a vote farm, so that they can keep those people captive. If anything, I want the Republicans to have a message that sets the captives free. There is, you look back in history and kind of marvel. I'm reading through the Old Testament again right now, and I marvel at the fact that the miserable 430 years of slavery that the people of Israel went through, and then the terrifying exodus from that slavery, and then the just another 40 years of wandering about in the desert, and frankly, a lot of whining and complaining by the former slaves who were saying to their leaders, hey, why don't you take us back there? At least we had some good stuff to eat. All of that, human misery and frankly, human fallibility and foibles and ridiculousness has become part of the story of the people of Israel that they recite with pride. And that the adopted children of the people of Israel, people like me, Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, have also adopted that narrative. And I know many people in the African American community have also adopted that narrative of theirs. We are the people who were slaves, and we have been set free. And that is our story. It's a story of God's providence. It's a story of victory. It's a story of how something that is horrible can change in an instant and turn around and give you a whole new trajectory in life. In many ways, we are captive only by our own minds. But a lot of progressive politicians have figured out how to turn the knobs and dials on those minds to make sure we stay captive. And I think Republicans have an obligation to go into that factory where the knobs and levers and buttons are and start breaking them and open up the doors and say, here's a story of redemption. Here's a story of possibility. Here's an opportunity for us to learn from you and from you, for you to prosper and thrive in a country that is the only place on earth where you can do what you can do here. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members of BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.